All right, let's talk about the real biological costs of thinking. Most of us, we treat our minds like they have this infinite energy supply. But what if I told you that deep, creative thought, that's one of the most expensive things your body can possibly do? So let's just dive right in with a question that kind of challenges, well, everything. Is your brain really a computer? I mean, we hear this comparison all the time, right? But is it actually accurate? And maybe more importantly, is it even helpful? I mean, just think about the language we use every single day. We talk about reprogramming our habits, or processing information, or how we need to reboot after a long day. This whole idea of the brain as a piece of hardware, it's just baked right into our culture. But here's the thing we're going to get into. This metaphor, it's not just wrong, it's actively holding you back. And here's why. Treating your brain like a machine, it sets you up for what you could call a dangerous cognitive trap. And really, it's a mindset that pretty much guarantees you're going to feel frustrated and burned out. Yeah, looking at these points, I bet some of this feels pretty familiar, right? That expectation that you should have 100% efficiency all the time. The guilt you feel when you actually need to rest. Getting angry at yourself because you're not learning a new skill fast enough. Or that despair when you just can't delete a bad memory like a computer file. See what's happening? We're applying machine standards to our own human biology. And honestly, it's breaking us. And this quote, man, it just gets right to the heart of the emotional damage this causes. It says, the comparison has created a generation of people who feel obsolete or broken simply because they cannot maintain the soulless stability of silicon. Think about that. When you inevitably fail to perform like a machine, you don't blame the bad metaphor. You blame yourself. You feel obsolete. You feel broken. You start to believe something's wrong with you, not with the impossible standard you've been holding yourself to. Okay, so we've talked about the psychological cost of this bad metaphor, the burnout, the frustration, but what's the biological reality? Let's take a look at what we can call the brain's metabolic tax. And trust me, this is where the numbers get, well, pretty surprising. Okay, check this out. Your brain, the source of every single thought, every feeling, every idea you've ever had, it's just 2% of your total body weight. That's it. It's a tiny, tiny piece of your physical self. But, Anne, this is the punchline. That tiny 2% organ, it consumes a staggering 20% of your body's total daily energy. Just to keep the lights on, it is by a huge margin the most energy-hungry organ you have. And get this, that 20%, that's just the baseline. The moment you start doing any kind of deep thinking, synthesis, pattern weaving, high-level strategy, that metabolic tax just skyrockets. So here's the crucial takeaway from all this. Your brain isn't some cheap laptop you can just leave running forever. No way. It's a high-performance biological engine. It's a Ferrari. And when you ignore its massive energy demands, it's like you're trying to run that Ferrari on cheap, contaminated fuel. What happens? The system is going to sputter. It's inevitable. And when this becomes a habit, this chronic neglect of your brain's energy needs, well, it leads to a state we can call cognitive poverty. It's basically a state of mental bankruptcy. And the scarier part is, a lot of us mistake it for just normal life. So at the very core of this whole idea is something called a systemic energy deficit. And it's actually a really simple equation. The energy your brain demands is way more than the energy it's actually getting. And when that happens, guess what's the first thing to go offline? Yep, your higher level cognitive functions. I mean, does any of this sound familiar to you? That wall you hit around 3 p.m.? That's not a personal failure. That's brain fog from an energy deficit. Or when your logic suddenly loses its snap, or you get super irritable over some tiny little thing, that's your executive function literally shutting down to conserve fuel. And I really want this next part to sink in. These moments, they are not character flaws. This isn't about you being weak or lacking discipline. They're biological signals. They're the dashboard lights on that Ferrari engine, and they are screaming at you that you're running on empty. You're not losing your edge, you're simply bankrupting your own neurochemistry. And when this state becomes chronic, day after day, that's when you fall into cognitive poverty. And this is a state where your absolute grandest ideas, your most ambitious plans are stifled because the system is just too hungry to execute them. Your potential is literally being starved. Okay, so if the whole hardware metaphor is broken, if it's dangerous, what do we replace it with? Well, let's explore a much more powerful alternative. Thinking of the brain not as hardware, but as wetware.
So let's really break this down. Hardware, the old metaphor, it runs on a rigid, predictable code. But wetware, our new reality, runs on messy, complex chemistry. Hardware is a machine you upgrade. Wetware, that's a living ecosystem you have to cultivate, like a garden. It's not about soulless stability. It's moist, it's alive, it's chaotic, and it's always, always changing. And let me tell you, this shift in perspective, it's everything.
Okay, so what does this all mean for us, practically speaking? It means we have to stop trying to hack our brains and start learning how to actually fuel them. Let's start thinking of our mental energy as a finite, precious resource, kind of like a bottle of ink.
And here is the fundamental takeaway. Willpower is not some magical moral virtue that you can just summon out of thin air. It is a finite chemical resource. It's a direct product of your neurochemistry, and it burns fuel. So when that fuel runs low, your willpower, your executive function, they're the very first things to go offline.
Which brings us to this final, really powerful idea. Until you learn how to manage the ink with which your mind writes its reality, you will forever be limited by your own biological exhaustion. Think about that. Every decision you make, every creative act, it uses up a little bit of that ink. And if you don't learn how to manage it, how to refill that bottle, you're just gonna run dry. You'll be limited not by your talent or your ideas, but by simple biological exhaustion. And that really leaves us with one last provocative thought to chew on. Your greatest ideas, they're written in this ink. Your whole reality is. So the question isn't whether or not you have great ideas. I'm sure you do. The real question is, how are you going to fuel the pen? Hey, welcome. So today, we're going to tear down one of the most common and honestly, one of the most damaging ideas we have about our own minds. We're always told our brain is like a computer, right? A piece of hardware that we can just program for peak performance. But what if that very idea is what's holding you back? Let's get into why treating your mind like a machine is basically setting yourself up for a system crash. You know that feeling, maybe it's a day, maybe it's a whole week, where you just feel off, like you're running on buggy software or something. You're trying to focus, but it's just not happening. You try to be productive, but you end up just staring at the screen. You feel like this machine that's supposed to be efficient, but all you're getting are glitches. All right, so that feeling, that sense of being a faulty machine, that's where we're going to start. We're going to look at all the error messages our minds are sending us when we try to force them to act like computers. I mean, when we think of our brain as a processor, we just expect it to run at 100% capacity all the time. So when we can't maintain that perfect soulless stability of a silicon chip, what happens? We feel guilty. We see a dip in productivity not as a totally natural human rhythm, but as some kind of personal failure, an error in our own code. And you know, it gets even worse. A computer can delete a file in a split second. But have you ever tried to just delete a painful memory or a nagging intrusive thought? It's impossible. And the whole computer metaphor just makes us feel frustrated and powerless when we can't just drag those unwanted thoughts into the trash can. And this right here, this gets to the absolute core of the problem. In the world of machines, needing to rest is a system shutdown. It's a failure. But for our biological minds, it's a non-negotiable, fundamental requirement. So this flawed brain as a computer idea, it sets us up for this self-destructive loop of impossible expectations and, well, inevitable disappointment. So if the problem isn't some software glitch, then what is it? The truth is, the problem isn't in your code at all. It's in your chemistry. Let's dive into the chaotic, messy, biological reality of what's actually going on in your brain. Our modern world is just a constant assault on our brain's chemical baseline. We are surrounded by what you could call cheap dopamine, that constant ping of notifications, the rush from sugary foods, the endless hypnotic scroll. Our systems are basically in a state of perpetual overstimulation. And this chart, this shows the dangerous feedback loop that creates. You see that first bar? That's the initial dopamine spike. But then, to protect itself from this overload, your brain actually starts to shut down its own receptors. And that leads directly to the crash. That's the refractory period where your baseline for feeling good is now actually lower than it was before. It's a classic feedback loop failure. And this is what that crash feels like. It's that feeling of being totally flat, unmotivated. Nothing seems interesting or engaging. You're not lazy. You are literally in a neurochemical deficit. You just feel chemically gray. And it's not just about dopamine.
Most of us are fueling our brains with things that cause these huge glucose spikes, followed by massive insulin crashes. This plunges our brain into a state called neural entropy. It's a kind of internal chaos where your thoughts get scattered or your focus becomes super brittle, and your brain's security guard, the amygdala, gets hyperreactive because the whole system is just stressed out. All of this chemical instability creates a massive signal-to-noise crisis inside your head. Your best ideas, your ability to do that deep, focused work, that's the signal. But it's getting drowned out by all the noise, the chemical static of a system that's basically fighting its own internal pollution. So if you remember one thing, let it be this. When you can't focus, you aren't being lazy. You are chemically inconsistent. You're asking your brain to perform at this elite level while feeding it unstable, chaotic fuel. It just doesn't work. So now we can see the real enemy here. It's the metaphor itself. This whole idea that we are machines sets us up for this chemical and psychological failure right from the very beginning. Seriously, thinking we're computers leads us straight into these traps. We expect perfect efficiency. We get so frustrated when we can't just download a new skill. We torment ourselves trying to delete thoughts, and we treat the biological need for rest like it's a bug that needs to be fixed. And that brings us to the core argument of this whole thing, a really powerful quote from our source. Just let that sink in for a second. You are not a machine. You are an ecosystem. And that changes everything. So if we're not hardware, what are we? Well, it's time to introduce a new, and I think much more accurate way of understanding our minds. It's time to talk about your wetware. Let's just look at this comparison. Hardware is stable, it's rigid, it's programmable, but wetware—
For decades, we've had this one really powerful metaphor for how we think about our own minds. But what if that metaphor, the very thing we use to understand ourselves, is actually what's holding us back? Well, today we're going to explore a huge shift in understanding our own internal architecture, a move from hardware to something called wetware.
Oh, you know that feeling, right? You've got a deadline, a huge project, some big goal, but your brain just will not cooperate. You feel slow, buggy, like you desperately need a reboot, but you just can't find the off switch. It is so frustrating, and honestly, it can make you feel like you're failing, just for not being able to run at 100% all the time.
So where does that feeling come from? A lot of it stems from this one single flawed idea, the metaphor that your brain is a computer. The source material for this explainer calls this a dangerous cognitive trap, especially for those of us whose minds, don't always run in a straight line. Let's break down exactly why this metaphor can be so damaging.
When you put it side by side like this, the mismatch between tech and our own biology just becomes so obvious. We talk about our brain like it's a processor, but a processor doesn't get tired. We do. We get fatigue, we get burnout. We talk about our memory like a hard drive, but you can't just click and drag a painful memory into the trash bin. And our habits, they aren't just lines of code you can easily rewrite, they are deeply, deeply ingrained biological pathways.
And what's the real consequence of using this broken metaphor? We start to expect the same flawless, soulless stability of a machine from ourselves, from our messy, beautiful biological selves. And when we inevitably fail to meet that impossible standard, we don't question the metaphor. No, we question ourselves. We end up feeling broken, obsolete.
All right, so if we're not hardware, then what are we? It is time to just throw out that old, busted model and embrace a new one that's actually rooted in our biology. Let's explore a much more accurate and frankly more empowering framework.
Welcome to the concept of wetware. This is a radical shift in thinking. Your brain isn't some sterile motherboard. It is a living, breathing ecosystem. You don't need an upgrade, you need to cultivate it. This isn't about forcing yourself to perform like a machine. It's about creating the right conditions for a natural system to absolutely thrive.
Okay, so how do we cultivate this wetware ecosystem? Well, we do it by understanding its core mechanics. We need to shift our focus away from thinking about software and get down to the literal chemistry that's running the whole show. Think of it like finally getting the blueprints to your own internal chemical factory. Now this is the crucial point. We have to completely reframe how we think about things like dopamine or serotonin. These aren't just abstract feelings that randomly happen to us. No, they are functional physical signaling molecules. They are the actual levers and switches that determine the operational state of your entire mental network.
So let's meet the key players in this chemical factory of yours. First up, dopamine.
It's not just about pleasure, it's the molecule of pursuit and anticipation. It's literally the fuel for your ambition. Then you have acetylcholine. Think of this one like a powerful spotlight, allowing you to have intense focus and helping your brain weave new neural patterns. And finally, there's GABA. This is your system's coolant, giving you that sense of systemic calm and making sure your circuits don't overheat.
Now, when you start to understand these molecules and you create the right conditions for them to be in balance, you can unlock a state of peak performance that paradoxically feels almost effortless. This is the goal, to establish a totally new, way more effective baseline for your mind.
We call this the flow state. You know it. It's that incredible zone where time just seems to disappear, complex problems suddenly feel simple, and that constant struggle of effort, it just melts away. This isn't some magical state. It's the natural expression of a well-fueled, well-regulated biological system. It's what happens when your internal architecture is running at its full potential, without that constant threat of a systemic crash. Okay, so the big question is, how do we get there? I can tell you the answer isn't in all those quick fixes or biohacks you see everywhere. The real path is about building a solid foundation, something the source material calls substrate stability. Let's just compare these two approaches. On one side, you've got hacks and stimulants. They give you these temporary, really volatile peaks, and they're always followed by deep crashes. You might get a few minutes of frantic performance. But substrate stability, that's totally different. It's about building a resilient chemical foundation that can support consistent, high-bandwidth processing, not for a few minutes, but for hours. It's the difference between a drag racer and a high-performance touring car. This whole new understanding leads to a really profound shift, not just in your strategy for getting things done, but in your actual identity. You are no longer just a passive user of a faulty machine. You are the one in the control room.
And this brings us to the core change in your mindset. You stop being a victim of your moods, asking that old question, ugh, why don't I feel like it? Instead, you become an active diagnostician. You start asking, okay, what does my system need right now to perform the next synthesis? It's a fundamental shift from passive complaint to active, empowered management.
And this, right here, is the ultimate takeaway. Your mind is an incredibly complex, powerful chemical factory. And you're not just the cog in the machine. You're not a ghost in the machine. You are the chief engineer, and you have the knowledge and the power to manage the entire process. So the power is back in your hands. You're not a broken computer. You're a living, thriving ecosystem. You now have the schematics for your own internal chemical factory. The only question left is, now that you know you're the engineer, what are you going to build first? All right, let's dive into something that might just change the way you think about, well, thinking. It's called the Wetware Manifesto, and it takes aim at one of the biggest and maybe most damaging ideas we have about our own minds. You've heard this 1,000 times, right? I mean, we all say it. My brain is fried, or I need to process that. It's just a simple, clean way to talk about that incredibly complex thing sitting between our ears. But hang on, what if that simple little comparison isn't just wrong? What if it's actually harmful? What if thinking that way is setting you up for frustration, for failure, and for feeling like you're, well, broken?
I mean, once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. Your memory is a hard drive you can access. Your habits are just lines of code. You can be reprogrammed with the right life hack. It all sounds so efficient, so modern, so in control.
The problem is, this is what's known as a cognitive trap. It's one of those ideas that sounds super helpful and logical on the surface, but it secretly leads you down a really negative path.
And here's exactly how the trap works. When you think of your brain as a computer, you start expecting it to perform like one. You expect 100% efficiency all the time. No glitches, no lag, and absolutely no downtime. Sound familiar? That little pang of guilt you feel when you're just totally burned out and need a day off. Or that flash of anger when you can't just download a new skill immediately? And what about that deep, heavy feeling of despair when you can't just delete a painful memory? That right there, that's the emotional cost of this flawed metaphor. So let's just lay it out, side by side. The machine expectation is that you can just delete a memory. But the biological reality? You have to process trauma. We want to download a skill, but real, actual growth has to be nurtured over time. We demand 100% uptime from ourselves, but our bodies, our biology absolutely require rest. And this all leads to something pretty devastating. It's created, quote, a generation of people who feel obsolete or broken simply because they cannot maintain the soulless stability of silicon. Just think about that for a second. We feel broken just for being human. So it's time to just say the truth out loud and free ourselves from this trap. Your brain is not hardware. It never has been. It never will be.
Instead, a much better term is wetware. I love this. It isn't clean and perfect like a microchip. It's a living, moist, wonderfully chaotic, and constantly changing biological thing. It is literally alive.
And that brings us to the most important sentence of this whole idea. You are not a machine waiting for an upgrade. You are an ecosystem waiting to be cultivated. Man, that just changes everything, doesn't it? An ecosystem.
So the very first step is simple, but it's not easy. You have to consciously stop. Stop imposing the cold, rigid standards of a machine onto your own living, breathing biology. Stop expecting your mind to act like a MacBook.
And what that gives us is a whole new approach. It's a fundamental shift in perspective. You stop trying to reprogram yourself and you start cultivating yourself. It's the difference between being a mechanic trying to fix a faulty part and being a gardener tending to a living system.
So, what does embracing your wetware really look like, day to day? Well, it means acknowledging that you need rest and recovery, without guilt. It means understanding that growth is organic. It's messy and slow, not an instant software update. And it means finally accepting that emotions have to be processed, not just dragged into the trash folder.
Now, to be super clear, this is not an excuse to just do nothing. Not at all. In fact, it's the opposite. Understanding how your mind actually works as a biological system, that is the real key to unlocking its incredible, authentic power. It's about working with your nature, not fighting against it.
So I'll leave you with this one question to think about. How would you treat your mind differently, starting right now, today, if you saw it as a garden to be cultivated, not a computer to be optimized? What does your garden need? More water? Less weeds? A little more sunlight? Really think about it. Thanks for tuning in.